All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're looking at a 2,000-year-old mystery, and it's centered on literally just one single word. It's a word used repeatedly by Jesus of Nazareth in the historical accounts. But here's the catch. Almost every English translation over the centuries has rendered this word in a way that completely, fundamentally alters what was actually being said. It's a really fascinating look at how just one simple translation choice can shape an entire culture's understanding of community, purpose, and identity.
So the source material points out this incredibly fascinating discrepancy. For 2 millennia, English translations have taken the original Greek word ekklesia and translated it as church. We've been told forever that when Jesus said, "I will build my church," he was talking about a building, an institution, or a weekly religious service inside 4 walls. But as the historical record shows, the Greek word ekklesia literally never meant any of those things. By translating it as church, a massive decision was essentially made for the reader, completely stripping away the immense political and civic weight that the original text actually carried.
Think about it. When we hear the word church today, we almost certainly think of a destination, right? A spot on Google Maps, an event on your calendar, a building with a stage. But the ancient reality of Ekklesia was entirely different. It was a civic governing body. It was a summoned gathering of citizens who had been called out of their private homes to handle the business of their city. This was the exact same word used in Greek city-states for the lawful gathering of free citizens to make hard decisions about taxes, war, and justice. It wasn't a religious word at all. It was profoundly political.
Okay, let's move into our first main section, the anatomy of the Ekklesia, and see how this creates a totally different paradigm of citizenship. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to break down the anatomy of the word itself. Ekklesia is actually a mashup of 2 Greek words, ek, which means out of, and kallo, meaning to call. Literally, it translates to the called out. Now, in the first century Mediterranean world, this was the language of political identity. Jesus actually only used the specific word twice in the gospel accounts. And he wasn't talking about starting a new denomination or picking out a geographic location. He was talking about a people defined not by where they meet, but by the fact that they have been called out. According to historical records, when a herald walked through the ancient streets calling citizens to assemble, the ones who actually showed up, they were the Ekklesia. They were an active governing body, never just a passive audience sitting in rows. So, by co-opting this thoroughly secular concept and applying it to his own followers, Jesus wasn't inventing some new religious club. The source argues he was framing his followers as an alternative city, a counter-society that ultimately answered to a totally different king. Let's trace this back even further in our next section, the Old Testament shadow. Long before Greek was the dominant language of the region, there was this older Hebrew word, kahal. It essentially means a commanded congregation or an assembly of people called together. In ancient texts, the kahal was the commanded assembly of Israel, think Mount Sinai or the tabernacle. But crucially, the emphasis was never really on the physical structure or the rituals. The focus was always on the people who had been summoned. However, our source notes that this ancient assembly had a built-in limitation. It was functioning as a temporary shadow of something permanent that was still to come. So here's the breakdown. The old assembly, the shadow, if you will, relied on physical buildings like temples that could be destroyed. It depended on repeated sacrifices and a very specific geographic location. But the new assembly, the substance, it's entirely different. The new ecclesia is framed as a permanent identity, reconstituted not around a mountain or a specific set of laws, but around a person. The source describes it as a completed divine construction, built out of people, rather than stone or brick. The assembly doesn't build itself. The people themselves are the actual material. Which brings us to a massive tension in the historical record. Let's look at the purpose of the gathering. The text lays out this really central paradox. If the ecclesia is something you are, rather than something you attend, and if you carry it with you everywhere, into the marketplace, into your living room, why on earth did early Christians treat their risky, secret gatherings as so absolutely essential? They were meeting in catacombs and locked rooms, fully aware that a simple knock on the door could mean arrest, torture, and death. If the gathering itself wasn't the ultimate goal, why risk everything just to do it? Well, the answer starts with this incredibly rare Greek word, kyriake. It literally means belonging to the Lord. Early Christians started using this word to claim the first day of the week, Sunday. And they didn't gather on Sunday just because it was a convenient weekend day. They gathered because they viewed it as the day of resurrection, a day of new creation.
It wasn't about keeping some rigid commandment or just repeating the Jewish Sabbath. It was a celebration of a specific person who had claimed that specific time as his own. Moving on to Section 4, citizens, not consumers. This completely inverts our modern perspective of what it means to attend an event.
Back in the ancient world, there was this word liturgia. It was used to describe a wealthy citizen doing something like funding a public festival or outfitting a worship for the city. It was a very public act of service for the common good. And what's truly wild is that when this word, which, by the way, is exactly where we get our modern word liturgy, was applied to the Christian gathering, it completely subverted the idea of passive consumption. You didn't show up to be entertained. You showed up to do the work of the city.
It's like this. Today, a modern consumer evaluates a gathering based on, the quality of the music, how long the sermon is, and basically whether they got something out of it. But the ancient citizen? They enter the gathering to do the work of the city, to serve the assembly, and to make the invisible reality of their citizenship visible to the rest of the world. Our source argues that this stark contrast explains exactly why leaving a gathering feeling empty is so common today. It happens when someone acts as a consumer expecting to receive, rather than a citizen arriving to build. And history absolutely backs this up through a fascinating, almost entirely bureaucratic document. In 112 AD, a Roman governor named Pliny the Younger wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan. Pliny was totally confused by these early Christians because they refused to worship the emperor's statue. So he actually interrogated them to find out exactly what kind of subversive, illegal activities they were getting up to during their secret early morning gatherings. So Pliny interrogates them, fully expecting to uncover some violent rebellion, right? But instead, he discovers that they just met to sing a hymn and bind themselves by an oath. They literally promised each other not to steal, not to commit adultery, not to break their word, and not to deny a trust. The gathering, therefore, wasn't some passive religious service, and it definitely wasn't the end of their obedience. It was this highly specific moment where they renewed their oaths of citizenship before scattering right back into their normal, everyday lives to actually live it out. Which brings us to our final section, declaring a new king. Because gathering in a world that demanded absolute loyalty carried the ultimate price. We see this so clearly in the writings of Justin Martyr around 155 AD. He wrote to the Roman emperor describing these gatherings, and he didn't describe a building or some complex hierarchy. He described an identity, a people called out of idol worship to serve the true God. Keep in mind, he wrote this while living in a city that was actively executing Christians. This proves that for the early Ekklesia, gathering wasn't just a quaint cultural habit. It was a literal act of treason where they publicly confessed a different king. Let's think about this number for a second. 86. This represents the number of years a 2nd century bishop named Polycarp served his king right up until he faced a lethal ultimatum in a Roman stadium. The authorities basically dragged Polycarp into the arena and gave him a choice: swear by Caesar and live, or refuse and die. And right before being burned alive, Polycarp calmly replied, 86 years I've served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? He wasn't afraid of the earthly gathering that was about to happen in that arena. Why? Because the source asserts that the earthly gathering was merely a visible manifestation of a heavenly reality. As far as he was concerned, he was already gathered with the assembly of heaven. So, to wrap up this explainer, the source leaves us with this final, really provocative challenge about the true nature of this ancient concept. If the Ekklesia is not a building you enter, but a people you become, how does that change the way you view your own gatherings? Will you leave the building as the exact same person, or will you walk out carrying the assembly with you into every room you enter? It is a fascinating reframing of a word we all thought we knew so well.